PFR Nation, Happy New Year, everybody. This is Kevin Lau, your host of the Planning for Retirement podcast. And today is episode number 60, 5 things to watch for in the markets for 2025. So this is not a market prediction episode, all right, because they are always wrong. Although I will say I was right in my market prediction going into 2024 in a Facebook group with, I think it's over 60,000 members at this point in time. And the host of it, Andy Panko, put out there for everyone to put out their S&P 500 predictions for the year. And yours truly predicted 25%. And the S&P 500 closed officially at the end of 2024 at 25.02%. So listen, I got my crystal ball out for 2025, and no, I'm just kidding. We're not going to do any market predictions in terms of percentages. I think that's a waste of time. They're always wrong. It was complete luck. But I'm just having fun with my bragging rights for the entire year because, listen, you can't take that away from me. But listen, if you are PFR Nation, so who is PFR Nation? We've got a lot of new listeners. I think we 4x'd our listener count in 2024. So thank you all for sharing the show, leaving reviews, telling your friends and family members. But PFR Nation, the Planning for Retirement Nation. Okay, most of you are over 50. I think the sweet spot, based on the demographics that I look at, is around this 55 to 65 range, all right? And you're either retired already or planning to retire. And so I say this because this episode, this sort of what to watch for the markets is not for everybody, right? Because you're not interested in swinging for the fences with big bets on Bitcoin, all right? Or big bets on Nvidia or Tesla. Those are cool stories and fun to watch for in the markets, but you're not really interested in losing your nest egg. Okay, you've been working and saving for the last 20 to 30 years. You've lived through the tech bubble. You've lived through the crash in 1987. You've lived through the Great Recession, 2008, 2009, which is when I joined the business in 2008. Okay, so I've seen firsthand the impact on families that a significant downturn recession can have, especially as it leads up to your retirement. And so I guess I'm saying all this because it's so important to be patient and to remove emotion from the investment process. And it's very easy to get very tied emotionally to your investment portfolio balance, okay? You think back to 2022. How were you feeling at that point in time? I had clients retire in 2022. It was the worst year for a 60-40 portfolio in my lifetime, probably ever. Okay, where stocks were down 20%, bonds were also down 15%. Okay, and again, your goal is to worry less about the markets in retirement, not more. All right, and so I guess I say that as a backdrop because this market outlook is not for everybody. It's not for those that are sort of 35 and trying to swing for the fences and buying sort of altcoins on the crypto on Coinbase. Okay, this is not for you. And also, this is for those of you that have saved significantly for retirement already. Most of you have already achieved 7 figures of investments for retirement, and some of you multiple 7 figures of investments for retirement. And so you want to protect and preserve what you have, while at the same time protecting against some of the risks that every retiree faces, like inflation, like longevity, like tax risk, etc. So anyways, with that as the backdrop, I've got 5 things in mind that I want to cover that the markets are watching for, when it comes to the stock market, but also the bond market, all right? Because when I say the market, we're not just tracking the S&P 500. And I'll talk more about that in this episode, but we're tracking the S&P 500. We're tracking small caps. We're tracking mid caps. We're tracking international stocks. We're tracking fixed income. We're tracking global fixed income. We're tracking cash. We're tracking CDs. We're tracking annuities. This is what I'm talking about with the markets. And so I'm going to show 5 action items and 5 strategies that I'm going to be thinking through and implementing with our clients, our practice, as we go forward into the first quarter of 2025. For nothing else, this episode will make you look informed when it comes to the markets when you're talking to your buddies in your weekly golf game, the holiday cocktail party. But I guess the holidays are over at this point in time. So anyways, all right. So without further ado, 2 other quick asks. Number one, if you are the PFR Nation type of caliber, I'd highly recommend just follow the show, subscribe to the channel if you're watching on YouTube, and subscribe to the YouTube, because not only are we doing the podcast every other week, we're also doing weekly whiteboard fireside chats where I go a little bit deeper into a specific topic, either from the podcast or even from our financial planning practice, which we specialize in working with retirees and pre-retirees. So you're not going to want to miss those whiteboard fireside chats. Hope you're finding value in them as well. And so, yeah, we've seen some significant growth on the YouTube as well. We just started that a few months ago. So I'm super excited about 2025, getting more into the whiteboard fireside chats. All right. Anyways, so without further ado, let's get to number 1. Okay. Number 1 is probably no surprise to you, and that is inflation. All right. Is inflation still a threat? Okay. Or is it a fading concern? All right. We entered 2024. We came into 2024. The inflation reading was 3.1% year over year. People were feeling pretty good about that. That's part of why I said, hey, 25% for the S&P 500, because in my opinion, I said, hey, you know what? If inflation's coming down, Powell's going to feel good about interest rate cuts, and we're potentially going to see 6 of them in 2024, but not so fast. It kind of spiked a little bit in the first quarter, with higher than expected consumer spending. And so it kind of spiked up to 3.15 in February, then 3.848% in March. So we had a little bit of volatility after sort of the kickoff to 2024, but then it began to cool a little bit in April to 3.36, then 3.27% in June. And then, 3% in June, and then all the way down to 2.4% in September. And people were feeling really good. All right. Y'all were feeling really good about inflation and that, we're going to hit that 2% target that Powell wants to get back to the neutral Fed policy rate. But then October came, and then we had a jump in inflation unexpectedly to 2.6 and then 2.7% in November. So just this overall stickier than expected inflation has caused a lot of this volatility that we saw in the fourth quarter of 2024 to close out the year. So I was kind of reading a lot of these comments, on different Facebook posts and just online in general. People are like, oh my gosh, look how much I lost in, this month, which I'm talking about December of 2024. Not remembering the S&P 500 is up 25%. The bond market's up 3 to 5%. International markets are even up 7 to 10. Small caps are up 15 to 20. So sort of ignoring those factors. So, that's why I'm just telling you, do not take a short-term view when it comes to your portfolio. It's going to drive you nuts. All right. It's going to give you a lot of grace. That's why I have grace. I worry about that for my clients. All right. So if you are working with an advisor, they should be worrying about that for you. And if you're DIYing, set up an investment policy statement, which is going to be one of my takeaways, spoiler alert, at the end of this episode. Set up an investment policy statement for each account. Bucket your account so you understand each time horizon of the account you're going to be withdrawing from in retirement. But the stickier than expected inflation, as we sort of ended the fourth quarter of 2024, that is, in my opinion, the top story going into 2025. All right. And, why did this happen? Well, looking at some of the data out there, automobile sales, I think I saw the highest that we've seen in 5 years. Holiday sales. Okay. So all of you that spent a ton of money over the holiday season, we saw a 3.8% increase year over year at holiday spending. Okay. But these are one of those things that, consumer spending drives GDP growth, and that does contribute to inflation. All right. So for all of you that are overspending, chill out a little bit. Let's get inflation down so we can see rate cuts come down as well in 2025. So that brings me to number 2, interest rate cuts. Number 2, and this directly relates to number 1. All right. Number 1, inflation is really going to drive the Fed policy on interest rates. So for 2024, we came into the year with the expectations that rate cuts were going to begin in March. That did not happen because of inflation running hot at the end of the first quarter in 2024. So we saw 3 rate cuts. Okay. So again, stickier than expected inflation, but we saw 3 rate cuts, 25 basis point each, which equates to 0.25% each. So we saw a 75 basis point cut on the Fed target policy rate, which was lower than the expectation. Okay. But again, because of some other factors with the markets, we still had a really solid year for the stock market. So inflation and interest rates, just for all of you sort of watching this and listening, it's not the only driver for stock market performance. There's still earnings. There's still GDP, consumer spending. This is what drives the economy. And so just interest rates alone is not going to be the only factor that's moving the markets, but it is a big factor, okay? Especially for you PFR Nation that have a nice core of fixed income in your portfolio, cash equivalents, short-term bonds, intermediate-term bonds, long-term bonds. Interest rates are directly going to impact the fixed income side of the portfolio, okay? So what are the markets expecting for 2025 with interest rates? So what I've seen is basically 2 rate cuts in 2025 for 0.25% each, or 25 basis point each. So that'll bring the Fed target down to about 4%. Right now, the target rate is about 4.5% on the Fed, and I'm using the upper tier. So down to 4%, and then continuing the rate cut theme into 2026 of an additional 50 basis points, getting it down to 3.5%, which many consider to be sort of the neutral policy rate that Powell wants to see. Okay, so again, kind of modest expectation for interest rate cuts. And again, I do believe that's directly correlated to higher than expected inflation in the fourth quarter. And that's why your portfolio has been a little bit volatile as we close out 2024 and heading into 2025. And I'm just telling you, I would expect that to continue. I do expect volatility to continue, not only because this uncertainty with inflation and interest rates, but also because that transitions me into number 3, Trump 2.0. The new regime is coming in. There was a Trump bump that we had right after the election, okay, and rightfully so. A lot of the policies that Trump has in his administration, pro-growth, pro-business, which contributes to the economy directly, lower tax rates, which is also great. But one of the concerns that many have is directly related to inflation, and that is on his tariff policies, okay? And again, the Trump tariffs that were implemented around 2017, 2018, Biden and his administration kept those intact, did not take those tariffs away. So they called it the Trump-Biden tariff policies, okay? But the expectation is that Trump may double down on this and potentially increase his tariffs, especially on Chinese goods. And the concern there is, guess who the largest importer of Chinese goods is? The United States, all right? And so I get and I understand what Trump is doing and what his administration is doing in terms of pro-America, bringing jobs back to the U.S., cutting corporate taxes, cutting manufacturing tax rates all the way down to 15% potentially to build things here domestically to combat inflation. But how quickly can that happen? And does this potentially cause an indirect impact to inflation or a potentially direct impact to inflation? So again, it all kind of relates to one another. So I think some of the policies that Trump has, I'm in favor of. Lower corporate tax rates, lower personal income tax rate, low, deregulation. I'm in favor of a lot of those things. But my concern, and I'm also in favor of pro-America building things here in the US, but my concern is, what does that do to inflation in the short term? And does it make sense to kind of lay out a little bit of a longer term strategy in terms of bringing these companies back to the US, manufacturing things here in the US before you just go nuts on the tariff policies on China? So that's kind of what I'm looking at. And I do believe the markets are looking at as well when it comes to 2025 and beyond. All right, number four. Let's get into number 4. This is really the big driver of the markets, the S&P 500 in 2024. If you remember 2023, the theme was the Magnificent Seven. All right, so you had the 7 big tech stocks, which included NVIDIA, Tesla, Amazon, Microsoft, Meta, Apple, Alphabet. I think that's all of them. 2024 was the same theme, but then you add in Broadcom. So that's the theme was, or the acronym that people like to throw around was Batman, BAATMAN. Okay. And essentially the thing that blew me away on this one was the top 10 stocks in the S&P 500, which included all of those names that I mentioned plus 3. So the top 10 stocks in the S&P 500 have contributed to 59% of the gains since October of 2022. And so as a result of that, because it's market cap weighted, the index, the S&P 500, because of this, it's very top heavy at this point. Because of that's really been the driver of performance. We now have the top 10 companies representing 32.5% of the market index, which is the highest level. Did some research on this. I could not find a level where the top 10 companies had a higher weighting in the S&P 500. If you go back to the 90s, the top 10 represented about 20% of the index. Number 1 was IBM, which my dad worked for a short period of time and had a significant portion of his portfolio in IBM stock. As a result of this, many of you may work for some big tech companies and probably understand the same thing. Maybe you have some restricted stock units that are paid as part of your compensation, and all of a sudden, 20, 30, 40% of your portfolio is invested in some of these big tech companies. Well, listen, IBM at that point in time had a market weight of 2.9% of the index. Today, there are 4 companies that have higher than 4% market cap in the S&P 500, all right? You think of names like NVIDIA, Tesla, Apple, Microsoft. These are great companies, but again, because of the outperformance of those specific companies relative to other companies in the market, has resulted in some overconcentration in some of these big tech names, which again, I'm talking to the PFR Nation type of individual that is approaching retirement. You don't want to see a 40, 50% drop in your portfolio overnight, like we saw in 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003. And that period of time during the tech bubble was very, very painful. And so it's just one of the takeaways we're going to talk about is this rebalancing process. But my question is, and many of the question is, will that theme continue? Obviously, the big contributor in 2024 was this massive investment into artificial intelligence, into AI. Okay. And so my opinion, that probably will continue. Okay. It's going to continue. And I do expect these companies to continue to perform pretty well in 2025, but you never know. if rates continue to remain high, if people stop spending, if we run into some geopolitical risks or some tax complications, we could see some volatility in the markets. I guess what I'd urge you to is don't get too emotional in this one in terms of FOMO. If you have adequate exposure into big tech, great. Enjoy the gains that you've had in 2023 and 2024, but don't get too overconfident, too aggressive or too risky when it comes to big tech. But really, that's been the driver of stock market performance, both in 2023 and 2024. And the question is, will that continue? And we will just wait and see. All right, number 5, the last thing I want to throw out there, and you may not be thinking about this one, but I absolutely do. And this is the Consumer Sentiment Index. Okay. How people are feeling about the markets, how people are feeling about investing. All right. And so this is sort of that FOMO factor I just talked about. And if you remember in the middle of 2022, all of the experts out there were calling for a guaranteed recession. Okay. We had already experienced about an 18% decline in the markets at that point in 2022. And the market kind of traded pretty flat in the second part of the year. But ultimately, we saw a pretty big sell-off in 2022, both in stocks and bonds, and everyone was guaranteeing a recession. And technically speaking, we did have 2 consecutive quarters of slowing GDP. So in my opinion, it was kind of a little mini recession, but the White House didn't like the term recession. They said the economy was slowing a little bit. Okay, but I posted this on my LinkedIn, and it was a chart from the University of Michigan, their Consumer Sentiment Index, which is the one I like to track. I believe that's the most widely accepted Consumer Sentiment Index. And what I posted was in June of 2022, the Consumer Sentiment Index hit an all-time low at 50. Okay, 50 was the number, their index number. And historically, just for reference, it's average around 85. Okay, and rightfully so. No one was feeling optimistic in June of 2022. Inflation was at 9.1%. Interest rates had already begun to increase rapidly beginning in March of 2022. Countries were still kind of coming out of the pandemic shutdowns, which being in Florida, I was kind of shocked about. I remember I traveled to DC in 2022. I said, what's going on right now? People are still wearing masks all over the place. I mean, it was like the pandemic was still going on in 2022, but the S&P 500 in the start of July, was about 3781. And I posted on my LinkedIn because I said, listen, I know we've had a painful start to 2022, but oftentimes when consumer sentiment is low, there are buying opportunities in the market. It kind of goes back to this Warren Buffett quote I like to say a lot, although I do not like the verbiage on it, but it's, the quote is specifically, be fearful when others are greedy and be greedy when others are fearful. And again, I don't like the term greed, but I think what Warren Buffett, the Oracle, was trying to communicate was, listen, when people are running for the hills, when no one's feeling good about the markets, that's when there are buying opportunities because you're sort of betting on the future of America, the future of these companies. So why not do that? Okay, in my opinion, that's really when the buying opportunities come. And again, the S&P 500 to start July of 2021 opened at 3,781. Well, it just closed on December 31st at 5,881. That's a 55% increase in about 2.5 years since that consumer sentiment index hit an all-time low. Okay. And I just like to track this because I want to see, are people getting a little bit greedy? We had, back-to-back 20+% on the S&P 500. Are people going a little bit too FOMO on the markets? All right. And so right now, for those of you that are interested, the consumer sentiment index just closed in December. I believe it was at 74. So still below historical average, which is, I like that, but it's creeping up a little bit, especially after the election in November. I do believe people are feeling really confident about the markets, and a lot of money flew into the stock market in November and in December. But we saw that volatility. We saw inflation and interest rate concerns sort of rear their ugly heads again. And that could be the potential story in 2025 as well. And so I'm going to continue to track that consumer sentiment index closely. And again, for me, for my practice, I'm not making big bets on this one. Listen, we have a defined investment policy statement for my family. We have a defined investment policy statement for each client that we're working with, which is, hey, what is our asset allocation goal as a whole that makes the financial plan work? Okay. And how does each account need to be invested in order to fit that overall asset allocation plan? Okay. So in terms of takeaways, I've got 5 for you. That's my first one, is if you do not have a defined asset allocation for your retirement plan, you need to make one right now. Okay. Because otherwise, movements in the market are emotional to you. Okay. Whereas if you have a financial plan that says, hey, I need to be 70% equities, 30% fixed income, because That's what makes my financial plan work. That's what makes my retirement plan work. You're not as emotional. Obviously, it's painful to see what happens when the markets go down, which who knows, that may happen in 2025. All the experts are assuming the market's going to go up another 10, 15, 20%. I'm sort of cautiously optimistic on that one. But if you have a defined investment strategy for each account, it's going to matter less in terms of the day-to-day movements of the market because you know, hey, long term, this is what I need to stick to. This is what I need to abide by in order to make my financial plan work. So don't get too high on the highs and don't get too low in the lows. Okay. And having an investment strategy for each account allows you to sort of act unemotionally, if you will, to market movements, even though it's very difficult. And I understand when you're approaching retirement, when you've recently retired, it just matters more. You're living on the portfolio now. Okay. For maybe not all of your income, but a good portion of your income might come from your portfolio. So that's number one, I would say. Number two is with that sentiment in mind, with a defined investment strategy in mind, it's probably a good time to think about rebalancing your portfolio. Again, we had the big run up in big tech in 2023 and 2024. I'm not saying abandon big tech. That would be silly. But hey, let's take some of the gains off the table that you've experienced in 2023 and in 2024 and maybe rebalance the portfolio to see if there's a broadening in the market for some of these other asset classes, like small caps, like mid caps, like value stocks. Okay. And even in the fixed income side of the equation. Okay. And so that rebalancing process is so critical to stay disciplined, stick to your financial plan, and ultimately remove the emotion from the investment process. So number one and number two, in terms of takeaways, are directly correlated to one another. Number three is rethink your fixed income strategy. Okay, I mentioned interest rates, where they are now relative to where they're expected to go going forward. And I already talked about this going into 2024. I'm going to say it again. It's just rethinking that fixed income strategy. Are interest rates ever going to be as high as they are today in the next 5, 10, 15 years or in your lifetime? No one has a crystal ball on that one. But when the 10-year treasury is sitting at around 4%, that's pretty attractive to me. Okay. And so rethinking your fixed income, many of you flighted to cash during 2022 and 2023 because of the high interest money market accounts, high yield savings accounts. Well, as yields start to come down, those interest rates are also going to come down as well. You're not locked into those rates. So now you have reinvestment risk. And so you need to get ahead of the curve and sort of think through, hey, how do I manage my fixed income as part of my portfolio? Do I create some sort of individual bond ladder, individual CD ladder to dedicate assets to generate income for you in retirement in that first 5 years in retirement? Super critical. Number four is create a spending plan. Okay, create a budget spending plan. If you're retired, can you give yourself a raise? Based on the portfolio performance last year, does it make sense for you to increase your rate of withdrawal to give yourself a raise? Do you have some major trips you want to take in 2025 or major home repairs in 2025? Okay. If you have not set a budget, it is impossible to think through, hey, what is my estimated spending either now or in retirement? And hey, how much of that will come from guaranteed income sources like Social Security, like pension? And how much of that do you need to supplement with your portfolio income? And what is your safe rate of withdrawal? So you can't really figure any of that out unless you have a spending plan, unless you track a budget. There are plenty of budget tools out there that are great that you can utilize, but you know what? Use a plain old Excel sheet, track your spending. A lot of the credit card companies and debit card, a lot of these banks will itemize your spending categories, see what you've spent over the last 12 months and put that on paper and say, hey, this is what our goal for our budget's going to be going for. I know my wife and I, we're going to be doing that in 2025 just because raising kids is expensive. Is a lot of you probably already experienced and is not getting any less expensive. Okay. So really thinking through the budget on an annual basis and even more frequently to revisit that budget is super, super important. Last but not least, number five, PFR Nation, is thinking through taxes. Okay, I've talked a lot about taxes and I'm going to continue to talk a lot about taxes, but obviously with the Trump administration coming in with full control over Congress, the expectation is, hey, Tax Cuts and Jobs Act potentially extending, but it's no guarantee. All right, there's thin margins, okay, in the House and the Senate. So what if the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act doesn't get extended? What if it does sunset at the end of 2025? Okay, so are there some strategies you can implement this year while tax rates are still what they are? Okay, now if I had a crystal ball, let me get out my crystal ball on this one. I do believe the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act will get extended or even potentially made permanent. And so just thinking through, hey, what is my tax bracket now? What do I believe it to be in the future? And then sort of making that drive your investment decisions and contribution decisions and distribution decisions. Does it make sense for you to do some Roth conversions? Does it make sense for you to do some pre-tax contributions? Does it make sense for you to do Roth contributions? Does it make sense for you to do a combination of both? Okay, so really thinking through the tax planning aspect of retirement is super critical. So you can actually be proactive in retirement as opposed to reactive. The unfortunate part, I've been doing this for almost 17 years, is that many retirees in the early phase of the older boomers, if you will, when they retired, Roth conversions were not even a thing. When I started in the industry in 2008, 2009, they were not a thing. Okay. And if they were a thing, most advisors were not able to talk about them because they couldn't talk about taxes. We couldn't talk about taxes with clients. And so if you are sort of on the younger end of the baby boomers or even the older end of the Gen X and you're about to retire, you recently retired, you might potentially have some period of time where you have lower tax brackets where you can fill up with those Roth conversions. Okay. Conversely, let's say you're in a high tax bracket now. Let's say you're in the last couple of years of employment and you're like, hey, you know what? I'm in the 32% bracket. Maybe it makes sense for you to do some pre-tax contributions today, defer that income for when you do fully retire and your taxable income goes down. Then you can implement some Roth conversion strategies. And so thinking through the conversions is huge. And then thinking through that bucketing strategy I mentioned earlier. Once you have that overarching investment policy statement, that investment strategy for your family that says, hey, you need to be 60% equities, 40% fixed income. Well, if you have multiple buckets, maybe you have a taxable brokerage account, maybe you have tax deferred assets in an IRA or traditional IRA. Maybe you have Roth accounts, maybe you have HSA accounts, kind of thinking through, hey, what is the timing of withdrawals? When am I going to be tapping the first bucket? When am I going to be tapping the second bucket? When am I going to be tapping the third bucket? Or what bucket's going to be for legacy for my kids? And ultimately implementing a strategy. Well, hey, some accounts might be a little bit more conservative. Some might be a little bit more aggressive based on the time horizon, but then thinking through how that impacts the taxation of those accounts. Because generally speaking, the more conservative an account is, the higher the taxes are going to be on that particular account because of the increase in income producing assets like dividend paying stocks or like fixed income. So just thinking through that concept of where do you own investments in which bucket? That's the tax optimization of asset location. And then, of course, thinking through required minimum distributions, thinking through your charitable strategy, thinking through your estate planning. This all sort of goes hand in hand with the tax optimized retirement plan. So that's it, everybody. I hope you found it valuable. And listen, this is not advice. Remember, this is not advice. Please consult with your own advisors. Please get an advisor. Okay. I already did an episode on this one. Ask ChatGPT when to hire a financial advisor. And I did a whole blog post on where I would go to hire a retirement-focused financial advisor. So even if we're not a good fit for you, there are great resources on the podcast, on the YouTube, where you can go to and find a great advisor that can help you. All right. If you are interested, in working with me one-on-one, with my firm one-on-one, we have a retirement readiness survey link in the show notes. Just fill that out. We just ask you some basic questions, high-level questions about your goals, your current situation, your assets, income sources. And I will follow up with a personalized video with areas of opportunity that I see within your retirement plan and ultimately what an engagement would look like if we are a mutual fit to work together. We still have some spots for 2025 available, so make sure to act quickly on that one if you are interested in working with my firm one-on-one. But as always, make sure to share this episode with someone else who is PFR Nation caliber, or someone else that is approaching retirement, that is recently retired, that has let's say 7 figures or more. So overachievers, if you will, from an investment perspective, because I do believe that those individuals will also find value in our content. Next episode, I'm excited for this one. Number 61 is going to be exciting. I've got a few topic ideas, but I'm most excited because one of my team members, Roberto Fortuna, is going to be joining me on that episode. So Roberto, get ready. We're going to have some fun on this one. So Roberto he's been a huge part of our success in our team in 2024. I'm super excited to have him as part of the team and his expertise on taxes and just financial planning in general. So yeah, I'm gonna have him on the next episode. So make sure to stay tuned. You're not gonna want to miss that one. And until next time, this is Kevin Lau signing off.